All right, Jason, how are you?
I'm awesome today. How are you?
I'm good. It's been a while since you and I talked alone.
Yes, alone. So many
We've had
exciting.
interviews and
Yeah.
lots of stuff going on. So today, this was your topic, and I'm gonna hammer you with questions because we're talking about IPSs, and I've actually heard it phrased different ways, but an investor policy statement, is that what you
Yep.
know it
Or
to be?
investment policy statement, or even investing policy statement.
Okay, yeah. In our episode with Karsten, and the follow-up episode to Karsten, he kind of pushed you on the replenishing the bucket strategy, right? Because he has this big idea that the bucket strategy is essentially window dressing, and it was something that you hadn't addressed in your IPS. Now, you shared your IPS with me before, and
I did.
I can confirm that there was nothing in there about how you would refill the buckets, replenish the buckets, sell stocks or sell bonds or whatever your diversifying asset is to replenish the cash bucket.
Yep.
And so I can confirm that it wasn't in there, but I want you to convince me that I actually need one of these IPSs because I've seen it and I'm like, do I need this?
I don't think that's an unfair question, Eric. As part of the homework that we always do for our conversations, I was digging around the Bogleheads forum. Those, generally speaking, right? If you're on that forum, you're pretty financially aware. Some of them are, seriously aware and total money nerds.
Yep.
But they did a poll at one point. Now that I think this poll might have been 10 years old, but the forum's older than that. And they asked, how many people had at least an investing plan, which is actually a simpler document.
Okay.
And it was only about half.
Yeah.
So, obviously there's plenty of people doing great stuff without an IPS or even the simpler type plan document. For me, I find it useful. I don't know if I will convince you and anyone listening to our conversation by the end of this, but I will give it my all because I, in fact, have found it useful.
It seems like something else to do. And in the laundry list of things to do, I'm like, well, what kind of value is this going to provide me? It strikes me that this was something that your financial advisor sort of brought to the party. Is that true?
It is true that the first time I even became aware that an IPS was a framework that had any utility, never mind that it existed, was through my former financial advisors. And so I think it's pretty common practice when you're working with any RIA firm or somebody like that who's going to guide you in some fashion on your investments. You do some kind of interview process, you sort of establish your goals and your sort of capacity, your tolerance for risk, things like that. And, all of that at the end of that process, you have a framing document, most often called an IPS, that really lines up your objectives, your plans, your kind of all the framework around what my investing approach, practices, and philosophy will be like for the long term. And so that is definitely the first time I became aware of it. But it's also true that since I left the services of that firm going on a year ago now, that I had took it on myself and began to find value in updating it with my current approach. And we can talk about that.
So, it strikes me that there's probably not too many different flavors of what your investment goals are going to be, but maybe I'm just being naive here. If I'm thinking pre-fire, my investment goal is probably going to be total portfolio return, right? And maybe post-fire, it's going to be capital preservation. Am I just being kind of naive here?
I think when you're talking about like the top level objective, that's probably true because, it's not until you go kind of a level down or peel the onion a little more that you start to come down to, these are the 4 or 5 things specifically that I care about. But sure, at a high level, I agree with you.
Yeah. Okay. I suppose if we get the dividend investors in here, they might have a different spin.
Yeah,
yield
is right? Yield is another sort of high level goal that many people have.
So what's your current goal right now?
Well, my goal is pretty simple. I'll read it for you if you find that useful. So the purpose of my investment portfolio, the one for me and my wife, is to provide for our long-term financial security using a total return strategy, as you mentioned, employing well-diversified low-cost assets, where total return is defined as the annual return on investments, including appreciation, dividends, and interest. So you're absolutely right. Long-term growth, yes, it's important, preserving capital. Those things can be at odds with each other, but that also includes finer points like, minimizing sequence risk how I can, because what do I want to do? I want this portfolio to last while we are withdrawing. And of course, that withdrawal period hopefully will be decades. And so this whole sort of framework is really set up to make sure that we're able to achieve that.
Yeah. So was this something that you like? I'm just curious if it changed at all since you took over management of your portfolio from your financial advisors. Like, is that something that they wrote and you just kind of like twisted the dials a little bit and changed it up a little bit, or like talk about that?
It's a good question. When I first took on, full oversight of our finances, our full portfolio management, and et cetera, originally I did just tweak it a little bit. I made sure that, the high level asset allocation, which I had changed a little bit, was accurate, and made a few other changes. But as I started to think about it more and, do more of my own homework, seeing what other approaches people had taken, I realized that things were not in there that were more on the kind of account maintenance and the very tactical side. Yeah. And it's totally true that if you go out there and Google for different people's investing policy statements, you do see a very different range of granularity out there. Some of them are very simple. Some of them are multiple, 4 or 5 pages long. But I think 1 or 2 pages is pretty common. And so I found that some things were missing that I wanted to put in there, frequency of rebalancing, the tolerance around those bands, a 20% relative change, triggering a rebalancing event, et cetera. So I started to do that over I think the late spring and early summer. And the revision date on my current IPS is July. And the last thing I added in there was what we started this conversation with, and that is putting in my strategies for frequency of selling, and how that ties to the rebalancing frequency. Oh,
okay, cool. Well, would it be helpful to kind of walk through the different sections in your IPS?
Sure.
I mean, we talked about the goal. The goal, I have to imagine, is kind of the top line, sort of directing statement, right?
That's right.
What follows that? What other categories?
Okay, so and we'll of course make this available in the show notes, so be sure to check those out. The links in the description. Yeah, I'll make mine available.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, 100%. One thing we didn't say is, much like your overall financial strategy, we're investing for the long term.
Yeah.
And so barring change that you may make, like, using a rising equity glide path, which of course you can also spell out very clearly in your IPS, the framework of this thing shouldn't really change unless there's a major life event, positive or negative, that would cause you to do that.
Yep.
So the next thing would be the specific objectives. And I called out 4 goals in our IPS that seemed important. The first, probably pretty basic, generating income from our investments to support annual expenses. We will take withdrawals, and they are not to exceed our withdrawal rate ceiling that we've set. The second, in doing so.
Wait. Are you putting in what those annual expenses are? And so I presume you're not putting that in the public document that you're sharing, but are they in your IPS?
They're not, because for me, expenses can be fluid. But what I do have set, and I have this definition farther down in the document, is my annual rate ceiling. And as we've discussed before, my maximum withdrawal rate is 3.25%. That's what I've modeled. That's what I've been working with. I am currently withdrawing below that. And that's why I word this as withdrawals not to exceed our rate ceiling. So even if our expenses change over time, as long as I'm staying true to that withdrawal strategy, I think I'm doing the right thing.
Okay, gotcha. Yep, that makes sense.
The second one, probably also pretty obvious. In doing so, we want to try to minimize potential tax liability where we can. That's a goal of how we're going to approach maintaining our portfolio.
So you don't feel like you have to pull your fair weight in the country?
Oh, I absolutely do. And I think I have paid a tremendous amount of taxes, and that's what I'm supposed to do. But of course, we always like to talk about the difference between tax evasion and tax avoidance. And so we don't want to pay unnecessary taxes. We want to make sure that our withdrawals are done in a sensible way.
Paying the minimal necessary.
Yes, but not letting the tax tail wag the portfolio dog, of course.
It strikes me, going back to this withdrawal rate, that sounds like that's something that could be potentially changing over time.
Yeah, it could. And I think right now I have my ceiling set where it is, but as we go farther out it doesn't mean that I couldn't change my thoughts on that. It's a good question. The way we set up our number, our fire number, and then looked at our expenses, we know that we're doing well at a 2.7% withdrawal rate right now.
We talked about it being really conservative, so I was thinking okay,
it is.
Maybe something that belongs in here, and maybe this is a revision you need to make in the future as you think about this. But as you get outside of that early window of sequence risk, which I know according to Karsten never goes
never
away.
Gone.
But you're going to feel a lot different 5 years in, knowing that the machine is operating as you expect it. And that may be a time to revisit that and say, okay, every 5 years, I don't know what that looks like.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. You'll see when we get to the bottom, I put in kind of a hand wavy statement about, there being occasions where you could exceed it, and that's why withdrawing below is a good idea. But let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Permission slip to violate the entire IPS.
Well, I wouldn't call it violation, but we'll see what you think.
Okay.
3 is pretty much nuts and bolts. It's, that I'll monitor the portfolio allocation against the targets, benchmarking returns against expectations, and that it's totally okay to consider revisions to strategy, if our personal situations dictate. But we won't do so in response to short-term market conditions. That's not something that we want to be doing. Market timing of any kind.
I'm laughing because this just strikes me as you speaking with yourself. You're having a dialogue with yourself. It's like one shoulder speaking to the other shoulder.
Well, I mean, I like to think that this all follows logically. I'm not trying to weasel out of things, but I do think of this as it's a document that I hope can live and speak for itself. And so, one of the things I think about with an IPS is kind of like anything. It's not, really estate planning, but it fits pretty well with it, right? I think about like my wife, Lori, having to take this on, if I'm unable to, for whatever reason.
She's going to call me.
She might call you.
What is this thing? Or like just wad it up and throw it away. Forget that.
If a trustee needs to be overseeing our finances at some point, this is a document that would be referred to in our letter of instruction that somebody could use to make sure they're following our wishes.
Buddy.
Right?
Yeah. Okay.
This is the way I think about it.
All right.
It doesn't mean everybody has to.
No, you're an organized guy. I get it.
Well, I mean, let's just take a step back for a second, Eric, right? I am not going to sit here and talk to you and say that, well, everybody needs to have something that looks like this, because they don't. Honestly, if most people just had a simple plan, an investing plan just defines what they're trying to do and what are the assets, where are they located and what are the funds they want to invest in. And that'll just help them stay on track and remind themselves why they're doing what they're doing.
Yeah.
That's great. And you could do that and you probably put that together in 20 minutes.
I mean, I'm kind of kidding with you here a little bit.
I know.
Because what I've noticed with my wife and I, as we're trying to get our financial house in order, and we're in a different stage than you are, obviously.
Totally. Yeah.
But, one of those things after we met with this financial advisor, he's like, you need an emergency side letter of instruction and you need this and that. And so I've been trying to pull all these things together. And part of that process has been trying to onboard my wife into some of these things. So for example, like a password manager, like, I don't know how long you and your wife have been using a password manager and sharing passwords, but for us, it's been less than 6 months. And my wife is completely hesitant to take all the passwords, which she has effectively on digital sticky notes everywhere, and collate them into this system. So I'm just picturing myself here getting onboarded onto the IPS, right?
Yeah.
And I see the value in kind of, codifying some of these steps that we've made, allocation, when we're going to rebalance, and especially in light of I may not be around forever. So, it makes sense to kind of put those things in writing, but I'm trying to think okay, how am I going to convince my wife that this is actually important to do? You know what I mean?
Well, that's a fair point. And it's not to say that you can't start somewhere and then, have that document evolve. It should be looked at as a living document. It doesn't mean you're changing your whole investment strategy, but the way you define it could change. And, and maybe another thing that we should link in the show notes, one of the most popular IPSs that you see referred to on Bogleheads was written by a user. I think their name was Sunny, if I remember right. Yeah. It's so tiny. It's just a few lines, but it calls out, in very brief words exactly what they aim to do without a lot of unnecessary detail. Yeah. And that would be a great starting point for anybody.
I mean, I like this just it existing as this kind of basic instruction book for in your absence for someone to kind of execute the plan. Because that's essentially what this is. It's like,
Yeah, it is.
yeah, documenting what the precise plan is. And yours sounds like, I mean, I don't want to preempt, all the different steps and stages of this thing. But I just kind of wanted to put that out there and say like, okay, it is effectively a plan. How detailed it needs to be kind of remains to be seen. So what's next?
The last objective in there is a good example of something that's poorly defined now, but that we will add granularity to over time. And that is to leave a meaningful inheritance for our daughter and to enable directed giving to causes of our choosing. Right now we're not taking explicit steps, to move this certain amount of money and do these things. Yes, when we did all our modeling of, safe withdrawal rate and portfolio longevity, we would put the percentage that we, aim to have left at the end. But as you know, better than anybody I talk to regularly, depending on what curve you end up on, what the market does, that you could end up with far more than your principal you started with or a fraction of it. So that's something that we anticipate revisiting over time.
So how would you define meaningful?
I don't know, honestly. But, maybe a stab at it would be like saying something like, I want 15% of my starting portfolio value to remain at the end.
Okay.
And you could model that in the safe withdrawal rate toolbox as one example.
Yeah, no, that's a great tool for actually doing that.
Yeah, totally. So the next section is time horizon, and this could very much differ by person based upon the age at which they put this together, their likely lifespan, depending upon their own family and their own health circumstances. I like to talk about worst case planning in air quotes here. So the time horizon that I have defined is long-term investment time horizon, where worst case plan to 99 years of age, absent any information otherwise.
You're not going to live that long, dude. Sorry.
Yeah, probably not. I mean, statistically speaking, I'm not, but I've got an awful lot of people in my family over 90 years old. So I got to assume that my money's got to last.
It's an interesting question, though, because, when you get beyond, how much traveling you're going to be doing in your 90s? I don't know how much travel you're going to be doing in your late 80s.
Absolutely.
So it's like, it's really interesting to think about how these assets, like what assets support you in what stage of your life. I heard an interesting podcast this week.
Okay.
I think it was an interview that Doc G did with someone who lost his wife to cancer in her 50s. He's in his 50s. And he had planned out various assets like his house that he was going to basically mortgage, as he got older. And he had certain plans for certain assets that he had in there. I suppose that's something you could codify in this IPS. But you've chosen to say, okay, we're going to leave it a little amorphous right now while we're approaching the age of 50, and we'll define it later. I like that.
Yeah, thanks. So the next section it's just a statement about risk tolerance, and it's acknowledging that based on how we look at the world, was all considered in putting together this investment program. And there's a lot of factors that influence that, but they include, personal risk tolerance, asset allocation, lifespan, present financial condition, our goals, et cetera. So
what's your risk tolerance?
I would say it's moderately aggressive. It's not aggressive like you, but it's clearly not overly conservative. There's a lot of people on Bogleheads who, like to start with a completely flipped ratio of bonds and equities, as I do, right? Yeah. I'm 70-30.
Again, it's kind of it's a little bit amorphous though, right? It's like rate something between 0 and 10, and you can't use 3 or 7.
Well, Ed, this is a good question. And, one of the more interesting exercises that we did, and we've done this with a couple of different advisors over time, was you go through this kind of battery of questions that, you and if you have a partner, each answer independently about, and it sort of frames up your risk tolerance as one of those things. It's like, well, would you rather choose this investment that has a 50% chance of doubling, but it has this chance of so they do all these scenarios.
God,
and some
I hate
of those
questions.
Some of those are mathematical like that, and some of them are a little softer. And that's one of the things that is used in that kind of onboarding meeting. I forget, there's a name for it that advisors tend to use for that meeting, that you go over that and they sort of make sure they understand your kind of personal preferences and risk tolerances. And then it's a marriage of that with your actual investment goals.
It's like the financial Myers-Briggs.
It's kind of like that, yeah.
Except you end up with moderately aggressive, and like, I don't know what to do with that.
Yeah. Well,
You
I
know?
mean, so, and this is kind of something you referenced earlier. So the asset allocation I have is a product of where I started with advisors, more than 8 years ago at this point, and then how my own personal thoughts evolved over time. And, our conversations over the last, year and a half have very much been a part of that. My own research, et cetera. And then that's how we get to where we are now, which is the next section. And that's sort of my target allocation.
Yep.
And that has changed over time. It hasn't gone night and day.
Yeah.
But as you know, it's changed. I added more bonds. I, removed some funds with higher expense ratios, simplified the portfolio while trying to preserve, the optionality I had in there before.
Yep. So you got your asset allocation in there. What's next?
So the next section was just a brief couple of statements about selection criteria, because, one thing you don't find in a lot of IPSs is the specific funds that are being held in those, to define that asset allocation. And to me, that makes sense. I don't know how you feel about this, but, depending upon a variety of factors, you may choose to change the underlying funds that go into your international allocation or, some other portion of your,
You're talking about
portfolio.
tilting something.
Well, not necessarily a tilt, Eric, but you know what I mean? The exact funds you use, because let's talk about tax loss harvesting intermediate treasury bonds.
Oh, okay. I see.
You're going to move to a different fund. Well, to your point earlier, it seems like a silly paper exercise to keep updating this document when a specific fund changes.
Yeah.
But what I think is important is defining the thoughts around, well, why did we select funds, right? Things like expense ratio.
Yeah, I was going to say low cost, right?
Yeah, low cost, favoring passively managed indexed funds over those that are actively managed. I did make a statement in here that single stocks are appropriate up to a ceiling of 5% of total portfolio. And that's as much a reflection of what mine currently are, which is around 3% single stocks of the total portfolio. And giving a little, room in there if I decided to take on a little bit more, but not more than 5%.
Okay.
What's the review process? So basically going to monitor performance and, document it quarterly and, review the overall investment program annually. Yes, this is long term, but that doesn't mean that periodic adjustments aren't appropriate if anything is kind of going out of balance, but you should be able to justify it, in line with the tenets of the IPS. So just a couple sentences on that. Probably one of the more important things, especially germane to the conversations you and I have had on this show, is the next couple sections. And the first is on rebalancing.
Couple sections?
Well, look, man.
How many pages is this?
2. We're on the second page, man. So the next section is rebalancing, right? Pretty simple. It's in line with what you and I talked about before. It says the percent weighting of each asset class will be allowed to vary within a reasonable range of plus or minus 20% relative to the target. And then we will decide the best way to effect transactions to rebalance that, making, of course, efforts to minimize the impact of tax. And rebalancing will happen twice a year in May and November. And the rationale for that is one is basically midpoint of the year, and the other one is, late in the year, but still early enough if you got to think about the whole portfolio and your whole financial picture heading into tax season, right? And so,
well, it's when dividends are paid, isn't it?
Yes, but when they're announced, right? It's not like they're announced 2 days before.
Yeah.
So, but you got to think about things like if you're thinking about Roth conversions or you're thinking about maximizing that 0% capital gains ceiling. So the thought here, and I'm not going to say I'm the most clever person in the world. I've seen other people refer to doing a rebalancing if you're doing it twice a year, kind of in this time frame, because it gives you time to contemplate the tax implications of all these moves, and rebalancing is just one part of that. So that's the frequency that I've elected to do at this stage, and that could change, but this is what I've defined.
And the basic research that has been done by Vanguard and others is that rebalancing frequency doesn't play a huge role in the total portfolio return, right? I mean, you don't want to do it too frequently,
right? And you want to be consistent because
that shaves off potential return, right? You're always rebalancing from the asset that's further ahead into the one that's lagging. Yes. So that will actually shave off returns. So I forget what they said about twice a year.
Twice a year. I mean, and Carson has written about this as well. Twice a year seems, by many measures, to be about right. Once a year is perhaps too infrequent. Quarterly is probably okay. Monthly is maybe too much because, of course, you're balancing fees and capturing momentum and things like that. So I've been twice a year. Feels good to me. So that's kind of what.
Is that what you've always done, and you're just kind of putting it down in your IPS now, or is this a change?
I would say the way that my former advisors and I talked about this topic was always we look at it quarterly.
Yeah.
We may make
that seems more reasonable. Like quarterly.
We may make changes, but we don't change something every quarter. So when I look back, it feels like twice a year is about the time where things were really happening, if they were. So I don't think it's terribly different, perhaps slightly, but this is what I've elected.
As I hear you read through all of these sections, I'm like, okay, well, geez, for someone who's trying to manage their whole financial life and also work, and I'm not pretending like I'm more busy than someone else, but if you really want to put this into action, is there a way that you can automate it?
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And of course, rebalancing is also probably less of an issue for the early investor. True. Many of whom, especially if they're following kind of current financial media, people on the fire path, they're probably investing in, total market,
Sure.
VTSAX or VTI, and maybe they have an international fund in there as well, but probably not too much else. And so it doesn't become so much of a big deal. It becomes a bigger deal as time goes on. Most importantly, you just don't want to ignore it.
Yeah. I mean, it does strike me that your pre-fi IPS is actually going to have an additional line item about like savings rate or something like that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think it probably would in many cases.
Because, I mean, that's something that can be automated into your financial life and can actually save headspace. And that's something that can, distribute into a certain asset allocation. Was that a category that you had in your IPS before reaching FIRE?
No, didn't. We had, it was a conversation point where, we would agree on kind of what our savings goals were. And then periodically we would evaluate them as my income increased and I wanted to increase my rate of savings, or what to do with one-time income like bonuses, for example. But it wasn't a part of my IPS as I recall, but I also don't have that one in front of me.
Yeah. Okay.
Next section fits really well with the topic you and I have discussed recently, and that's what's the withdrawal and cash holding strategies. And so because we have a variety of different types of accounts and I am under 59 and a half years old, the taxable accounts are going to be the biggest source of income for us in the present. And so talk about the fact that what will we do to get cash? Well, asset sales will happen as a part of, this biannual portfolio rebalancing. We want to avoid market timing, do it on a schedule. We'll also transfer dividends and capital gains income that's received in that taxable account to an operating account. And that operating account is what we'll use to fund our lifestyle. And we will do auto withdrawals on a regular basis. We do this monthly presently, but we will not exceed our rate ceiling of 3.25% as measured as a percentage against the portfolio starting value when I started withdrawing.
When you started withdrawing?
Yeah, when I started withdrawing. And I also put a statement in there, which I find appropriate and I think makes good sense to me. And I say that this rate may be, but is not required to be adjusted for inflation each year. Because whether you're talking about, the 4% rule of thumb or any variance thereof, you're always talking about, inflation adjusted withdrawals. I did not adjust my withdrawals for inflation this year. So I didn't automatically increase it because I found that we're able to maintain on our current budget, especially with the little bit of side income we have coming in.
Because you're not eating any meat, man.
Yeah, well, our grocery bills are probably lower than yours. I also have one teen and not two, but yeah, it's part of the practice that you can increase that withdrawal rate annually based on inflation rate, but we haven't elected to do that yet. The last thing in this section is just defining what our cash holding targets are. And we have 1.5 to 2 years of projected expenses as the range we want to keep that cash in. And I also state that the funds not needed for at least 1 year can be held in I bonds or other low risk vehicles so long as funds can be accessed when they're needed.
So when you get down to 18 months, you replenish to 24. Is that what that rule says? Or
it says that I'm allowed to keep it within that range.
So it's an absolute, when you get to 18 months, you got to replenish.
Correct.
So every 6 months you're going.
Yep. Unless I change my philosophy. Now, one thing I did do, you'll recall, we talked about the fact that I was still previously holding a 6-month emergency fund in addition to my cash allocation. Yeah. And so I did unwind that and move that into my my operating account at my last rebalancing interval. And so that allowed me to kind of defer selling because I had cash available.
You got rid of some of your factors of safety upon factors of
safety. I did. Huh? Yes. Yeah. I do pay attention. And I thinking about our conversation you and I had, thinking about the conversation we had with Karsten, and just kind of balancing all that with my risk tolerance, realized, I was holding too much cash.
You'd always just liquidate your wife's car again.
Yeah. I could just sell her car. She probably
buy her another Leaf.
No, she doesn't want another Leaf. No, she's all set. The final.
Oh my
section,
God, there's more.
There's one more, dude. Again, I
thought this was going to be a short episode.
So I made a final section called Other Considerations, and I just think these are good reminders, not necessarily just for me, but again, somebody else. If anyone else is ever managing this, these aren't so bad. So the first is, income will be managed to the best of our ability to stay within the 0% capital gain limits. This will also support our aim to qualify for subsidized ACA insurance while we're eligible for the same.
This is a lean fire clause.
It's not a bad clause, man. The second point, dividends will not be automatically reinvested except in the HSA account, right? We like optionality, so I want to be able to choose what happens to the dividends. Usually
not
taking
even in
them
your
out.
Roth?
Nope. Because
Really?
I want to, basically it gives me a rebalancing opportunity, right? If something's drifting a little bit and I hold several different funds in my Roth, which is true, I want to be able to choose where it goes.
Okay.
Okay.
What are you holding in your Roth, if I might be so bold?
Geez, you may ask like I remember off the top of my head. It's
not
primarily S&P index fund.
Yeah. Okay. You wouldn't
Primarily,
want
but
to
there's
reinvest in
some international index fund in there too, I believe.
that? I see. Okay.
Yeah. So I can choose.
Gotcha.
Third point, and probably an unsurprising one to have in there, partial Roth conversion strategies will be investigated annually to determine whether and to what degree this tactic will benefit our long-term goals, right? Reminder, when we do our annual financial review, consider whether Roth conversions are part of the strategy or not.
Whew. Is that it?
Nope, one more.
Oh my God.
Annual consultation with our CPA will determine what, if any, retirement contributions are to be made.
Okay. Because you still have some residual income from these massively profitable businesses you've started.
Oh yeah, yeah. The working at the winery one day a week, and Lori working at the brewery one day a week. Those are
and
big
two
money.
sides of pie, buddy.
Oh well, two sides of pie. Yes, you're right. After we pay for the web hosting and the podcast service, we have enough money to have a delicious coffee.
We still have not had that delicious coffee yet, but
no, maybe if we put that buy me a coffee button, we could have two coffees.
Okay.
So that's my IPS. I mean, and when you see it written, it's just 2 pages. It's a table. But did I put in more detail than I would need if it was just for myself? Absolutely. There's definitely framing and clarifying text in there, and not everybody may want to do that. But for me, I like that this feels like something I can just hand off to somebody. So it was definitely part of my approach.
Yeah.
Do
I need one of these?
Let me put it this way. I doubt you're faltering because of it. Maybe it would give you a slight amount of hesitation in unwinding your bond position by reminding yourself why you have a certain bond position.
It's already done, man. Too late.
Yeah, I know. I'm aware. See, as soon as Carson gave you permission, you're like, whoop, just selling that.
Back up to 100-0. No, man, I said that in previous episodes. I was like, I see the value, but I'm still 2 years out, 2+ years out at this point. So it probably makes sense to be a little more aggressive. Come on, you can get behind that, can't you?
Yeah, I enjoy your dice rolling. 2 years out, I didn't have that bond allocation that you had either, but I mean, I also got lucky. as we talked about, right? I mean, the fact that I was so heavy in equities, even in the last year, meant I got to ride the end of that 12-year bull market that I wouldn't have been able to as fully participate in if I had started getting more conservative in that last 2 years, that glide path that many people follow. So that worked out. But, was it the best strategy? It was a strategy. Certainly wasn't the most conservative. So, yeah, I think it's a useful document. It's a helpful document to answer your question. Do you need one? No, obviously you're getting by fine without one, but I think it's a useful part of anyone's financial toolkit. Obviously, I'm convinced by it.
If I didn't want it to be that sort of thorough, I mean, here's one of the things, Jay, that I like about this dialogue is that you're presenting me the perfect plan, right? It's all nutted out. Everything's figured out. And so I get to look at that, and, the rest of our viewers and listeners get to benefit from looking at all of the tick boxes that you filled out, and then sort of sniping the things that are useful to their own financial situation.
Totally.
So what I like about it is, I may have forgotten 6 or 8 of those things on your 48 point checklist.
Come on, man.
And so I can fill in the gaps in my own plan. Not, I'm not sure I did look at your investment policy. I can't even say it, man.
It's called IPS. It's so much easier.
I looked at it before we got on here, but I thought, man, I don't know if this is for me, man. It's just kind of saying stuff that I already know and feel. And for you, what you're telling me is that there's some comfort in being able to look back at that and say, okay, I've defined these things. And if I have to hand it to somebody else, they can execute the plan that I developed. And, my question is like, well, who's that person going to be? Is it going to be Lori? Is it going to be your wife?
Maybe.
Because she may just look at it and go, I'm just going to kind of keep it where it's at. You know what I mean? But yeah.
But somebody's got to do that rebalancing. That Lori doesn't want to have a monthly financial meeting. And so we don't have one. Annually, I show her the side letter of instruction where all the information is with all the accounts and everything and the name of advisors she could choose to go seek if she doesn't want to do this. And this is just another piece of that. I don't want to have it come across that that's the only reason I have this. Honestly, it helps me a lot too. It forced me to think through all these things. It gives me something I can go back to and refer to at any time, because let's face it, I'm not in my account every day. I'm twice a year, doing rebalancing, annually looking at it as a whole. And, over time, who knows, I may give it less and less attention. It could just become purely this little tactical exercise I do periodically. And having this document is going to be nice to refer to and give me kind of a jumping off point. I think what everybody would benefit from, back to your actual question, would this benefit me, would benefit by having a very simple investing plan, right? Here's my asset allocation. Here's why it's like this. And this is what how I'm going to manage it.
Yeah.
Boom, boom, boom.
Yeah,
simple.
That's what I was hoping you were going to say. Cause I feel like, I already have that I keep that in my Notion that I share with my wife. So if there's ever a question, it's like, here's what we decided at our last monthly meeting.
Oh, so that's how you use it. It's ammunition.
Well, sometimes it's like, well, no, we didn't. So I always take notes, man. I'm the secretary at these meetings. I'm like, here's what we decided. And then we can just reference it back and, then I can be right.
Yeah, so picturing, I don't think you and Laura email each other, but I'm picturing emailing her like, if you will refer to section 1, we discussed this last week, and this is why we are doing this.
She's a scientist like you, man. She needs documentation and data. So
well, you better prepare some graphs of performance, because that's the only way she's going to be comfortable with all this.
A Sankey chart.
Oh, a Sankey chart. Yeah, those are pretty good for showing cash flows.
Sankey or Sankey?
Sankey, no D. Yeah, Sankey. It's like cash flows.
I know it's cash flows, but do you say it Sankey or Sankey? Sankey.
I say Sankey.
It's named after Richard Sankey.
Yeah, there you go. You remembered his first name. I sure don't. Or you made it up. It could be like Steve.
I might have made it up.
Chip. I have
Chip
no idea.
Sankey. That was pretty brilliant, man.
Oh, you like that?
Chip Sankey.
All right, so Eric, after 45 minutes or so of excruciating detail, have I convinced you of the value of an investing policy statement?
You have not.
Okay, I didn't think so. Have I convinced you that having some kind of documentation of your financial plan is a good thing?
Yes, absolutely. No,
And you already have one, so hey, you're ahead of the game.
no, I was going to say the emergency side letter of instruction, which was there's got to be a better name for something like that. But the financial advisor that you and I both met with previously, we hired to look over our portfolios. He suggested creating one of those and gave us a template. And I actually found that to be a document which was really kind of a little bit time consuming to create, but I could see how that that may serve some of the same purposes that you're talking about here with the IPS. And it's just it's a document to hand to somebody else that says like, here's how the whole thing operates. Cause I'm kind of struggling with this. Like we have paperwork over here and paperwork here. It's like just this whole massive like financial volume of our life. And I'm trying to kind of get, sort of segment things and just keep it all together. You know what I mean?
I take your point. I think to me they're related, right? The letter of instruction, as I've executed mine, is all the accounts, right, where money is held, insurance, the mortgage, all of that in one document, some potential advisors to use if you need to, contacts a different company. So that to me is like purely documentation, I guess. And this is a mix of the tactical elements of something like that, but also the operating principles, our objectives, etc. It's very specifically tied to how we manage our investment portfolio. So, maybe it's just another element of your overall estate plan, I guess. But yeah, I think of them as different, but they go hand in hand.
Right on. All right. Well, you're going to share yours with us, and we can all laugh at it and cry at it.
You can laugh at it all you want, and then use one of the simpler templates that I'll link in the show notes too. I'm not going to be offended. I'm not going to change mine. I hope nobody looks at mine who's a trained finance expert and just tears it apart, because that'll just be too much for me to bear. But if you feel like you need to, go for it.
All right, man. Well, it's been real.